Minerva presents. Welcome, fellow book addicts, to a gathering of literary minds where stories come alive and dreams take flight. Prepare to be swept away by the mesmerizing narrative of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Liking my videos is like giving me a virtual high five, and following my channel is like becoming part of an awesome community. So, if you're enjoying what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment to join the conversation. Part 1, Chapter 1. When a new student rouses his classmates from their slumber, the students immediately see him as a misfit. He is characterized by his clothes and his manners as one who strives to, but does not fit into the upper bourgeois of his classmates. He nervously gives his name as Charles Bovary, and the reader is introduced to one of the principal characters of the novel. Charles is a diligent student who is not very quick-witted and does not seem to possess any natural talents. It is only through hard work that he maintains his position at the middle of his class. It becomes evident that the only way Bovary will ever achieve anything is through perseverance and not through his natural talents. Charles' father, Charles Denis Bartholomew Bovary, is a former army surgeon who was dismissed from his post after a controversy involving prescriptions. After his dismissal, he searched for a life of leisure as a farmer, but he quickly discovered that he could not make a fortune farming. He also developed a taste for liquor and women. He finally settled on marrying for the source of income, but he quickly went through his wife's dowry. Charles' mother had loved his father in the beginning of their marriage. With age, she soured toward him and grew tired of his wandering eye and drunkenness. Over time, she became bitter. After Charles was born, his mother and father disagreed on his rearing and education, but they both spoiled him. He was the center of his mother's attention, and his father let him roam like a wild animal. He also was strict with young Charles, sending him to bed with no fire, teaching him to drink, and to ridicule religious processions. When Charles was 12, his mother finally prevailed, and he began taking lessons with the local priest. The priest was very busy and had very little time for lessons. It was decided that after his first communion, he would be sent off to school. Before he finished his education, his parents took him out of school and placed him in a baccalaureate program in Rouen. He had a difficult time understanding his courses and quickly fell into a life of leisure. He began skipping lectures and frequenting the bars. Because of his lackadaisical attitude, he failed his final exam. His mother understood, and she arranged for him to retake the test. He crammed for the exam and finally passed. His mother finds him a position in Toasties, where the former doctor just died. She, not satisfied with him having only this position, seeks a wife for him. She settles on Madame Dubuc, a widow with a reasonable income. Although Madame Dubuc is described as ugly and drab, the elder Madame Bovary has to put in a considerable effort to win her over. Once she and Charles are married, she craves his every attention and constantly is worried about what he is doing and if he thinks about her. She always asks for a new tonic and for him to love her more. Part 1, Chapter 2. The Bovarys are awakened in the middle of the night by a messenger asking Charles to come set a broken leg at Les Bertaux, an 18-mile ride from Tostos. He has been called to the house of Monsieur Rouault. Upon his arrival at the farm, he is taken up to meet the patient. Charles is thankful that the break is relatively simple and easily corrected. He is then invited to dine with Monsieur Rouault's daughter before he returns home. Thus, the reader is introduced to the novel's title character, Emma. Emma is described very sensually from the start. Charles notices all the feminine refinements she possesses. As he looks for his riding whip, he brushes against her, and they both blush. Instead of returning to Berthaud 3 days later, as promised, he returns the next day and then regularly after that. After Monsieur Rouault begins walking after 46 days, Charles is thought to be a genius. He continues to visit Berthaud even though the patient has healed. He never questions why he enjoys his time on the farm so much. His wife, Madame Bovary, is at first excited about his going to help Monsieur Rouault because of the expected fee he will receive, but then she grows suspicious. She finally confronts Charles, and her description of Emma is far different than the one outlined up to this point. She describes her as someone who puts on airs, and she describes Monsieur Rouault as someone struggling to pay his bills. Madame Bovary makes Charles swear that he will not return to Berthaud. He begins to notice how ugly and rigid the widow he married is in comparison with Emma. When Charles's mother comes to visit, she greatly disagrees with the way his wife treats him. Then in early spring, Charles finds out that the notary who held all of his wife's money ran off with all his holdings and that she greatly exaggerated all her other assets. His mother, his father, his wife, and he all get in a huge argument after Madame Bovary's financial state is discovered. A week later, she dies while hanging the wash. When the funeral is all over, Charles returns home and realizes that his wife truly did love him. Part 1, Chapter 3. One morning, Monsieur Rouault comes to pay Charles for setting his leg. He gives him 75 francs and a turkey. While there, he attempts to comfort Charles on the loss of his wife and invites him to visit Berthaud again. Charles decides to take him up on his offer. He becomes accustomed to living by himself and enjoys not having someone to tell him what to do. One day, he arrives early at Berthaud, and he and Emma are left alone. During this visit, he and Emma bond while discussing childhood and time at school. She takes him to her room to show him all her memorabilia. It is after this visit that Charles considers what will become of Emma, and he decides that he should propose to her. Monsieur Rouault will not be displeased with Emma getting married. She is not an asset to him on the farm, and as his business declines, he fears that he will not be able to provide an acceptable dowry. Charles can never get up the nerve to ask Emma when the opportunity presents itself, but he finally breaks down and asks Monsieur Rouault for her hand. She accepts his proposal and wedding plans begin to be arranged. They decide the wedding should not take place until the next spring to ensure that Charles' mourning period is over. During the winter, Emma occupies herself making her wardrobe. Part 1, Chapter 4. The wedding guests begin to arrive in all manners of transportation. Some ride in two-wheeled charabancs and others in farm carts. In all 43 guests arrive. The guests' clothes are described in detail, with the wealthy wearing tails and the poor wearing only their best shirts. The wedding dinner is very elaborate, and Charles and Emma retire to their wedding chamber, where she has given instructions not to let any tricks be played on them. Some of the wedding guests think that Monsieur Rouault is being snobby because he will not let the wedding games go forward, and they feel he slighted some of the guests. The next day, Emma does not give a hint of what conspired in the bedroom chamber, but Charles acts like a young man in love and shows a great deal of affection toward Emma. After the wedding, the newlyweds leave to toast it. When they arrive at Charles' home, dinner is not prepared, and Emma inspects the home. Part 1, Chapter 5. Emma takes a tour of the house. The house is described in great length as an ordinary middle-class home in the country. Emma immediately begins making changes to the house. Charles feels completely happy, and the couple develops a routine of taking meals and going for walks together, and every morning Emma stands at the window as Charles leaves for his round. As Charles is experiencing the happiest time in his life, Emma begins to think she was mistaken about love. She remembers all the descriptions of love she had read about, and she realizes that she does not feel that with Charles. Part 1, Chapter 6. Emma has read many of the classes such as Paul and Virginia, and she has dreamed of living the charmed life of the characters in her books. Her father sent her to the convent to study when she was 13. She completely threw herself into her studies. The nuns thought that she might even join the order. An old spinster came to the convent for a week every month to do the mending. She would teach the girls songs about love and tell them stories, and she always brought along a romance novel that she would allow the girls to borrow. After reading these books, Emma becomes infatuated with the love affairs and the passion of the characters Later, even when she reads Walter Scott, she becomes obsessed with the historical and dreams of the lives of his characters. When her mother died, she suffered a great deal, even writing to her father that she wished she too could die. When her father comes to get her, the nuns are glad to see her go because she has slipped out of their control. When she first returns to Bertaux, she enjoys the farm life and giving orders, but soon she longs to be back at the convent. She becomes so bored with her life that she thinks she has nothing more to learn and nothing more to learn and nothing more to which to look forward. When she meets Charles, she easily persuades herself that she was falling in love. Now that she is living the life, she realizes that this is not the happy life of which she dreamt. Part 1, Chapter 7. Emma ponders if these, the honeymoon days of her marriage, are the best days of her life. She wonders why she cannot be in an exotic honeymoon location bonding with her husband. She thinks that if she were in one of these locales, she would certainly be happy because certain locations must produce a sense of happiness. She searches for something in common with Charles, but she finds that he is drab and has no interest in the finer things in life. Meanwhile, Charles continues to find everything she does incredibly interesting, and he treasures everything she does, even going so far as to frame her sketches. She, in an effort to produce some type of feeling within herself, caters to Charles. He submits to her every whim, such as giving up his nightcap. Charles' mother comes to visit whenever there is a violent episode in her home. Although Emma is kind to her, she is prejudiced against Emma. Madame Bovary Sr. thinks Emma spends too much and is wasteful. Her true disdain for Emma lies in the fact that Charles favors Emma over her. In an effort to keep the peace, Charles repeats his mother's suggestions to Emma. But Emma dismisses him and convinces him that he is wrong. When a patient of Charles makes a gift of an Italian greyhound to Emma, she adopts her new pet as a friend and confidant. On her strolls with her dog, she often wonders why she married in the first place, and she thinks about her friends from the convent and how they must surely be living better lives than she is living. In the fall, the Marquis d'Andervilliers invites the Bovarys to a ball at his home. When Emma and Charles leave for La Vaubyessard, the Marquis's home, Emma, is full of anticipation. Part 1, Chapter 8. The Bovarys arrive at La Vaubyessard, and they are personally greeted by the Marquis. The chateau is described a modern building with lavish design and rich accessories and decorations. Emma is disappointed with the Marquis because she is an unattractive woman of about 40. At dinner, the men and women are separated, as was custom. Emma is shocked that many of the women did not put their gloves in their wine glasses, indicating that they would not be drinking. At the dinner table with the women is the Marquis's father-in-law, who once was a queen's lover. Emma is fascinated by the old man. She cannot look away from him because he has been in court and slept in a queen's bed. Emma tells Charles not to dance as she gets ready for the ball. She implies that he is getting fat and that he is a country bumpkin who could never fit in with the aristocratic class. Emma is at first nervous about dancing, but she soon begins to enjoy herself and her surroundings. She notices some men who appear to be of a finer class, and she eavesdrops on their conversation. They are having interesting conversations about other countries and things that are foreign to Emma. As the night wears on, Emma reflects on her time a Lesberto, and she thinks that she has somehow changed and is not the same person that she once was. Then she sees a secret exchange of a letter between lovers. For the closing waltz, she is led by Vicomte, and when they change partners, she admires him from afar. Finally, Emma and Charles retire, but she lingers at the window imagining all the occupants of the other rooms and what they must be doing. After breakfast, they are shown the greenhouse and stables. They are led around on a special tour, and Emma is taken away by all the interesting, exotic, and luxurious accoutrements at the home. On their way home, Charles and Emma encounter riders. A few miles up, when Charles has to stop to repair their cart, he discovers a cigar case dropped by one of the riders. Emma imagines that it belongs to Vicomte. When they finally arrive home, dinner is not made, and Emma loses her temper and fires the maid right on the spot. The Bovarys have a very simple dinner that is contrasted with the dinner put on at the Marquis. Emma spends weeks remembering the ball and realizes a breach in her life has been created. Part 1, Chapter 9. Emma often goes to the cigar case that Charles found on the road and wonders about its origins and who it belonged to. She dreams about Paris. When the fishmongers pass her windows, she imagines them traveling to Paris. She buys a map of Paris and traces her fingers over all the streets. She begins subscribing to a fashion magazine and learns all she can about society. No matter what she does, her thoughts always return to Vicomte in Paris, and she pines for all the social circles to which she feels she is entitled to belong. All her surroundings remind her that she is living with less than what she thinks she deserves. She is even irritated with the stable boy because he is so poorly dressed. When she replaces Natassi, the maid whom she fired, she hires an orphan and attempts to train her to become a lady's maid. Although she spends most of her time locked in her room, Charles does not notice anything is amiss because he always comes home to a nice house and a hot meal. He is delighted with all the little changes she makes to the house in her constant attempts to make it into a nicer and more fashionable domicile, such as replacing the sconces and coming up with new and clever names for meals. Charles is in good health and good reputation, so in the hopes of keeping himself up to date, he buys a medical journal. However, he always falls asleep after dinner while he is reading. Emma is infuriated because she wants a dedicated husband. She thinks if he cannot be handsome and clever, he should at least be one of those husbands who work late into the nights. She wishes that the Bovary name could be famous, but Charles has no ambition, and Emma thinks he is dumber every day. In an effort to preserve her image, she attempts to make him dress correctly. He thinks she is concerned for him, but in reality, she is just trying to protect her image in the community. She longs for someone to open up to. She looks forward to the fall with the hopes that she will be invited to another ball, but an invitation never arrives. She is so disappointed that she gives up music, drawing, and reading. In her depression, she begins to notice her mundane surroundings where everything is always the same and will be the same for the rest of her life. She loves to watch the traveling organ grinder when he comes by the house. She sees it as her only window into what is going on in the rest of the world. She begins to let the house go. When Charles' mother comes to visit, Emma says the things she wants to hear just to placate her. In February, her father comes to visit, and she is left alone to entertain him. When he leaves, she is glad to see him go. Eventually, Charles thinks that Emma's nervous illness is cause for them to move. When Emma hears this, she begins to drink vinegar to make her illness worse. Finally, they settle on Yonville, l'Abbaye. When they leave for their new home, Emma is pregnant. Part 2, Chapter 1. This chapter mainly deals with a description of Yonville, l'Abbaye. It is a one-street town that is rather dull. It is a perfect example of small town, provincial France. The center of excitement in the town is Homais' pharmacy. Another interesting figure is the cemetery caretaker who grows potatoes in an empty part of the cemetery and is in charge of several maintenance activities around town. Homais waits at the Lion door, the local hotel, for the couple to arrive. The hotel has several boarders and houses the Hirondelle, a bus-like carriage. Monsieur Binet is one of the hotel boarders. He is described as having something to him, and the priest is described as a strapping man. He and Homais argue about religion. The Hirondelle finally arrives after being delayed because Emma's greyhound ran away. She blamed Charles for the greyhound getting away. Monsieur Leroux, the shopkeeper, tries to comfort her to no avail. Part 2, Chapter 2. When the Bovarys arrive at the inn, they are greeted by Homais, who has invited himself to dinner. While they wait for their table to be prepared, Emma warms herself by the kitchen fire. She is intensely watched by Leon Dupraz, a boarder at Amazi's who has also been invited to dinner. Leon is a clerk to the notary, and he is terribly bored in Yonville. Dinner turns out to be as dull as any other part of this town. First, the diners discuss medicine in the area, and then they discuss the weather. Emma and Leon turn from the group conversation and begin to talk to each other. They discuss the ocean and the mountains and far-off places. They become quite familiar with each other, with him even resting his foot on her chair. The Bovarys also learned that the previous doctor had spared no expense on his home, and they will be living in a nice house. When they arrive at the house, it is in disarray. When Emma goes to bed, she realizes that this bed is the fourth new bed she has slept in. Each new bed is a new chapter in her life. She figures that since her life has been so bad, it can only get better from here. Part 2, Chapter 3. Emma sees Leon in the square the next day, and he waits all day to see her at dinner. The dinner the night before meant a great deal to him because he had never spoken with a woman for so long before. She does not come to dinner that night, and he is disappointed. Homais is especially kind to the Bovarys because he was called in for practicing medicine without a license, and he wants Charles to overlook his advice to clients. Charles, meanwhile, is gloomy because he does not have any patience, and he is growing increasingly worried about money. He spends his time doting over Emma's pregnancy. She is happy to be pregnant until she cannot afford the layette she wants. When she realizes she cannot buy the layette, she seems to lose some affection for the pregnancy. She holds out hope that the child will be a boy. When the baby is born, it is a girl. Emma spends a lot of time choosing a name. She finally settles on Bertha after a name she heard at the ball. Charles' father comes to stay for a month after the birth. Emma is fascinated by his tales of far-off places and of his mistresses. She is even flattered when he indicates he is attracted to her. One day, Emma decides that she must see her child, who was put with a wet nurse after its birth. She begins to get tired on the walk, and she meets Leon, who accompanies her to the nurse's house. The time they spend together starts the town talking about their relationship. The wet nurse lives in squalor, and she asks Emma for extras. On the way home, Emma and Leon make small talk, but they sense there is something more to their feelings for each other. He drops Emma off at her house, and he goes to the hill to think about her. He thinks about how he does not think of Madame Bovary as a woman and how Emma stands out in his mind among other women. Leon has visited the Bovary home several times, and Charles never seems happy to see him. Part 2, Chapter 4. As winter approaches, Emma moves her bedroom into the parlor for warmth. From the window, she can see the street, and she watches Leon pass by twice a day. Monsieur Homais often calls on the Bovarys during dinner to discuss the news and patients. Justin, Monsieur Homais' nephew, who is also his apprentice, also hangs around the Bovary home, and many people suspect it is because he has a crush on the maid. On Sundays, Monsieur Homais holds little soirees. The group plays cards, and Leon always helps Emma with her card playing. After cards, Monsieur Homais and Charles play dominoes while Emma and Leon read together with a growing intimacy. Leon is also friendly with Charles, who sees Leon and Emma's relationship as natural. Leon brings Charles a birthday gift and Emma exotic plants. Emma gives Leon an elaborate coverlet. Their obvious affection leads people to speculate that the pair is having an affair, but Leon can never get up the nerve to declare himself to Emma. Emma will not even speculate that she is in love with him. Emma will not even speculate that she is in love with him until one day she discovers that she might be. Part 2, Chapter 5. In February, the group goes to see a new flax mill being built. While there, Emma gets the chance for a side comparison of Charles and Leon. Charles is described as unattractive and growing fat, while Leon is described as wildly appealing. That night, Emma skips the Homais soiree and stays at home, where she realizes that she loves Leon and he loves her. The dry goods proprietor comes to offer her goods for sale, and although she refuses, he lets her know that he is always available and can get her loan money if need be. Leon comes to visit Emma and she sings Charles' praises. After Leon's visit, she immerses herself in household chores, church, and even has Bertie removed from the wet nurse. For a while, she diligently tries to take good care of Charles and her household. Just as quickly as she threw herself into her domestic duties, she begins to grow silent and thin. The townspeople comment that she has class, but behind her facade, she is wild with desire. Leon does not suspect her love, and she continues to repress her love in an effort to conceal it. Everything begins to grate on her nerves, and she is exasperated that Charles does not notice. She imagines horrible things that could happen to put her in a position to reveal her love to Leon. She begins to cry, and the maid suggests that she tell Charles, but Emma begs her not to say anything. Part 2, Chapter 6. Emma goes to see the priest before catechism class. The unruly boys keep distracting the priest. He does not understand how a woman like Emma can have any problems, so instead of confiding in him, she leaves. When Emma gets home, she is so upset that she pushes Berthe off of her, and the child falls and cuts her face. After Charles bandages Berthe, Emma spends the rest of the day consoling her. Charles calls Leon aside because he wants to have a portrait of himself made for Emma. His devotion to Emma sets Leon thinking about how he has grown tired and bored of unrequited love. Leon immediately sets to convincing his mother that it is time for him to finish his law studies in Paris. He begins preparations for his departure, but delays leaving for several weeks. Finally, when he is about to leave, he has a few moments alone with Emma. Although they both feel a great sadness at his leaving, they only shake hands. Homais drops by at dinner to discuss Paris and how Leon will fare in the city. In the end, Olmes reveals that a huge agricultural show is coming to Yonville. Part 2, Chapter 7. After Leon leaves, Emma is very depressed, much as she was in the days after the ball. She cannot pull her thoughts away from him. So in an effort to dull the pain, she decides she deserves to indulge herself. She begins to buy fancy things from the dry goods store, and she decides to learn Italian. However, as Emma does with all her pursuits, she quickly abandons them. She begins to have the vapors, and Charles calls for his mother to visit to help Emma through her latest bout of depression. Charles's mother suggests that he cancel her library subscription and that he encourage her to make some changes. She also encourages her son to be more forceful with Emma. His mother leaves on market day. On the same day, Monsieur Rodolphe Boulanger calls on Charles for a bloodletting. Rodolphe faints, as does Justin, so Emma is called on to help. Rodolphe is taken by Emma, and he thinks she must be bored living with such a dolt of a husband. He decides that he should take her as a mistress, and that he will begin his seduction at the agricultural fair. Part 2, Chapter 8. Finally, the agricultural fair arrives. The entire town has participated in the preparations and all turn out for the event. Rodolphe takes Emma around the fair with him, and as one of the town's major contributors to agriculture, he feels he has to hide from the attendees in order to spend time with Emma. He is dressed very elaborately in a way that sets him apart from the other town citizens and in a way that makes him more exciting than other men in Emma's life. During the speeches at the fair, Rodolphe professes his love for Emma, but despite her interest, she plays it cool and does not seem interested in his advances. A woman wins a monetary award for working at the same farm her entire life. She has worked at the farm since she was old enough to work, and she will most likely die there. After the speeches, Rodolphe drops Emma off at her house. He goes off to think about her and the best way to approach her since his first attempt was unsuccessful. That night, at the closing ceremonies, Emma pays close attention to Rodolphe. She is engrossed in him to the point that she does not even realize that the fireworks have gotten wet and will not go off. Part 2, Chapter 9. 6 weeks go by before Emma hears from or sees Rodolphe again. On their next meeting, he again confesses his love for her, but she continues to resist. He works to impress Charles by calling him doctor when he walks into the room, and he suggests to the doctor that Emma come horseback riding with him for her health. Emma resists Rodolphe's suggestion, but Charles convinces her by telling her she can purchase a new riding habit. When Emma and Rodolphe go out riding, everyone comes to watch them ride in their striking outfits and with their expert horsemanship. They ride high on a hill where Rodolphe once again confesses his love. At first, she puts up a timid refusal, but finally submits to his advances. That night, at dinner, she is distracted. Once rid of Charles, she locks herself in her room and jubilates that she has a lover. The couple begins exchanging letters. Then, in her desperation to see him, she begins sneaking off to his house in the early morning hours. After several of these clandestine visits, he grows tired of her and tells her she is being careless and endangering her reputation. Part 2, Chapter 10. Emma begins to share Rodolphe's fears and becomes more careful when going to visit him. One day, she runs into Monsieur Binet duck hunting. She tells him that she is visiting the wet nurse. All day, she worries because she knows Binet knows that Berthe was removed from the wet nurse more than a year ago. She worries that he will gossip about her indiscretion with the townspeople. Charles, in an effort to distract her from her mood, takes her to Amessi's, where she runs into Binet. Binet makes an innuendo to her early morning escapade. but he does not reveal her secret. In light of this incident, Rodolphe and Emma find a better place to have their affair, in her garden or in Charles' consulting room. Because Rodolphe knows that he is loved, he begins to slack off in his affection toward her. Emma begins to feel guilt and thinks she should love Charles more. Part 2, Chapter 11. Omaze encourages Charles to undertake a new operation that he has been reading about to cure the stable boy's clubfoot, while at the same time enhancing both their reputations. Emma comes on board to help convince Charles because she thinks he can become the success that she has always dreamed he would be. Finally, he gives into their pressure and orders the prospectus on the surgery. After being pressured by many people in the town, the boy yields to the surgery. After the surgery, everyone thinks it was a great success, and there is a write-up about Charles in the newspaper. One evening, Charles is summoned to the hotel where he finds the stable boy, Hippolyte, in such pain that he cannot bear it. His foot is swollen, and Charles decides to let it air, but continues on his course of treatment for the surgery. After several days, Hippolyte does not improve, and the gangrene begins to spread. Finally, another doctor is called in who berates both Charles and Omaze for performing the surgery. In the end, Hippolyte's foot has to be amputated. Charles is terribly depressed, and Emma is angry that she ever thought he could be more than a country bumpkin. Charles says he needs Emma, and she thwarts him. His failure drives her right back into her lover's arms. Part 2, Chapter 12. Once again, Rodolphe and Emma's love is in full force. She often wrote him during the day, and they begin to pass notes back and forth through servants. She tries to convince him to take her away, but he resists. It would appear that Justin is falling more in love with Félicité, Emma's maid, but she is much older than he is, and she is being courted by another. Justin always hangs around with her and watches her do Emma's laundry. Emma convinces Charles to get Hippolyte 2 wooden legs to make up for his failure. The storekeeper once again appears with the bill for all her lavish expenses. She cannot pay the bill and manages to hold him off. Finally, when one of Charles' clients pay, she steals the money to pay the shopkeeper. Emma becomes bolder with her attitude and begins to wear different things, speak of politics and religion, and even goes so far as to be seen smoking in public. When Charles' mother comes, she is shocked by Emma's behavior. Emma and Charles' mom have a huge fight, and Emma finally surrenders and apologizes to Madame Bovary Sr. After the fight, Emma calls for Rodolphe in a secret manner they have. When he comes, she relates that night's drama and convinces him to agree to go away with her. She begins making preparations and ordering supplies for her trip. Rodolphe is not so keen on the idea of being saddled down with a woman and child and begins to think of ways to get out of it. On the night before they are to leave, they meet. Rodolphe looks so sad, but Emma thinks it is because he is leaving his former life behind. After he leaves the meeting, he plans to rid himself of her. Part 2, Chapter 13. Rodolphe tires to write Emma a letter, but he cannot think of what to say. He goes through a box of old letters in hopes of remembering what he loved about Emma. He finally writes her a letter saying she would be better off without him and packs it in a box of fruit, their usual means of communicating. When she gets the letter, she runs to the attic to read it and immediately thinks of suicide when she learns of his departure. Just as she is about to throw herself out the window, she is called to dinner. At dinner, she passes out and a new bout of illness begins. She is in a state of illness for 43 days. Charles gives up his practice to sit by her, and he lets Félicité take over rule of the house. Finally, when Emma feels well enough to get up, She relapses because Charles takes her for a walk near the bench where she and Rodolphe sat. At the end of the chapter, it is revealed that Charles is having money problems. Part 2, Chapter 14. Charles feels an obligation to pay Améas for all his prescriptions and supplies, even though a doctor is usually exempt from these charges. The bills continue to pile up since Emma's illness and Félicite has taken over. She does not have the finesse with the household that Emma had. Then, as a final blow, Charles gets a huge bill from the store for Emma's traveling supplies. In order to pay for all the bills, Charles takes out a loan from Leroux, even though he has no idea how he will make good on it. Emma begins to take comfort in routine, and she once again takes up religion almost feverishly. When Charles' mother comes to visit, she and Emma actually enjoy each other's company. Aimé suggests to Charles that he take Emma to the opera as a distraction. Aimé and the priest discuss religious doctrine. Finally, Charles agrees to go to the opera even though he does not have the money. He gets confused buying the tickets while Emma buys flowers and gloves. The couple arrives at the opera before they even open the doors. Part 2, Chapter 15. Emma is overcome by the opera from the beginning. She is totally enthralled with the romanticism of the opera. The tale of the lovers drives her to memories of the past, and she overcome almost to the point of fainting. When Charles goes to get her a drink, he runs into Leon. Leon comes and sits with them. Emma is so overcome in his presence that she loses interest in the opera. Leon and Emma convince Charles to leave the show early to go to a cafe. The trio has idle conversation, but Emma and Leon sense that they have more to say to each other. Charles convinces Emma to stay on in Rouen to catch another showing of the opera. Part 3, Chapter 1. Leon had been very busy with his law studies, but he still found time for ladies. His teachers thought him to be a good student, and he thought of Emma every once in a while. Over time, he forgets her. After the play, he followed them to their hotel, and the next evening he met Emma in her hotel room. She was surprised that he knew where she was staying, as she had not told him, but she chalked it up to fate. At her hotel, he confessed his love for her, and she pushes him away under pretenses. They agreed to meet the next day at the cathedral. That night, she writes him a letter telling him to move on, but decides she should deliver it in person. The next day, Leon takes his time getting ready and shows up at the cathedral on time where he has to wait for her. When she finally arrives, she does not give him the letter, instead deciding to take a tour of the cathedral. Leon drags her away from the cathedral and pulls her into a cab. He forces the cab to drive around town all day with the shades drawn. After a few hours, scraps of paper fly out the window. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Emma gets out of the carriage and sets off toward her hotel. Part 3, Chapter 2. When Emma arrives at her hotel, she has missed the coach to Yonville, and she has to hire a gig to catch the Hirondelle. She finally catches up, and when she arrives at home, she is told to go straight to home. She is told to go straight to Homais because there is an emergency. When she gets to the pharmacy, Amos is busy yelling at Justin. A book on sexual exploit falls out of Justin's pocket, further infuriating Homais. Finally, he just blurts to Emma that her father-in-law has died. Charles feels genuine grief at the death of his father, and his mother comes to mourn with him. The shopkeeper comes to talk to Charles about his note, and he sends Emma to discuss it with him. Verba tries to convince Emma to get a power of attorney so she can deal with all these small things. Emma mentions it to Charles, and he thinks they should consult a lawyer. She immediately volunteers to go consult with Leon and leaves for 3 days to Rouen. Part 3, Chapter 3. Leon and Emma spend 3 wonderful days together. For Emma, this is like the honeymoon that she always desired with Charles. When they take a moonlit boat ride, the oarsman mentions a man that Emma believes to be Rodolphe, and she shudders. Emma and Leon arrange for letter exchanges, and he says the power of attorney is in order. Part 3, Chapter 4. Leon gets airs around the office, and he spends his time eagerly awaiting Emma's letters. Finally, he breaks down and goes to Yonville to visit her. While he is there, she gets upset and promises to find a way to see him on a regular basis. Suddenly, she takes up the piano again, but she is rusty and begs Charles to allow her to take lessons in Rouen. He will not allow her, but she makes a scene, and every time she walks by the piano, she makes a snide comment until he finally gives in. She uses the piano lessons as an excuse to go to the city once a week to see her lover. Part 3, Chapter 5. Every Thursday, she rises and leaves for Rouen without waking Charles. It has become her routine. She watches out the window with great anticipation for the Hirondelle to get to the city. She maintains a room at a hotel so as not to draw suspicion. She is supposedly using her hotel room to get ready for her lessons and to stay at after her lessons. She must walk through all the seedy parts of town to her and Leon's love hideaway. The hotel room they carry their affair on in is described as reminiscent of a honeymoon suite with gaudy decorations and an oversized bed. They become so accustomed to spending their time in this room that they soon begin calling it our room. Leon is amazed by Emma and her experience, her beauty, and her knowledge of how to carry on an affair. She even refers to him in the diminutive as if he were a child. On the hill on the way back to Yonville, a beggar constantly badgers the riders of the coach. He is described as having some type of affliction of the eyes. Always on Thursdays, Emma would be pensive. Charles would inevitably ask her if something was wrong, but she always told him that she was fine. One day, Charles has an encounter with Emma's supposed piano teacher. She does not recognize Emma's name, but Emma produces receipts for her lessons, and Charles believes her. On another occasion, Emma and Leon run into Monsieur Leroux. She is frightened that he may talk, but he has something else in mind. Indeed, 3 days later, he comes to her to ask for money. When she tells him that she has no money, he suggests that she allow him to sell some property that she and Charles own. She agrees. He takes all the money from the property and issues another note. Charles eventually finds out about all the notes Emma has written, but she just explains them away. Charles is left to ask his mother for help, but instead of sending money, she comes for a visit. Of course, Madame Bovary, Senior, found the spending to be excessive, and she convinces Charles to tear up the power of attorney. Emma allows Charles to do away with the document, but quickly persuades him to fill out another one. Emma begins to get more reckless, daring even to stay overnight in Rouen. She always manages to allay Charles' fears after a bout of inconsideration. Part 3, Chapter 6. Leon had often dined at Amiens during his trips to visit Emma, so he felt obliged to return the favor. Amiens readily agreed on the pretense that it would do him some good to get away for a while. He chooses to come on Thursday. The same day, Leon is to meet Emma. Leon cannot manage to ditch Amiens, and he spent a good portion of the day with him. He finally finds time to slip back to the hotel to let Emma know what happened. When Emma finds out that Leon has spent the afternoon with Homines instead of her, she is infuriated. Leon is sensing that something is coming in between them, but he does not say anything. One day, after leaving Leon, she goes to sit in front of her convent. She remembers the first days of her marriage and the Vicomte. All her life seems so far removed from as whom she sees herself. Soon after, Her financial problems climax with the visit by the assistant of Monsieur Vincart, a loan shark. Leroux, despite his promises, had sold Emma's promissory notes to Vincart, and he was demanding immediate payment. Emma goes to Leroux to beg him for his help, but he refuses her. In a desperate attempt to find the capital, Emma demands the sum of Charles' inheritance, but there is none. She sends bills to Charles' patients and begins to sell her things. In her despair, Emma gives up taking care of the house and her child. She becomes almost frenzied in her worry. Leon notices that she is acting strangely. His employer counsels him not to see Emma anymore, and he promises he will not for the sake of his future. However, he can't hold out, and he agrees to see her. In her crying and overdramatics, Leon becomes bored with her. When she returns from their meeting, there is a sign on the door that everything they own will be auctioned. She once again pleads with Leroux, and he once again refuses her. As she storms out of his office, she screams, "You'll drive me to do something desperate." Part 2, Chapter 7. The next day, the sheriff comes to take inventory of all the Bovary's property. She is stoical as they go through all her property, including all the love letters she had saved from Rodolphe. She has somehow managed to keep Charles from finding out about their current state. The next day, she leaves for Rouen determined to call on every banker she has ever heard of. She even convinces Leon to go out in search of money for her bail. He does not like the request, and he promises to come to Yonville the next day. At the end of the day, she must return home. She does so with Homais on board. When Homais sees the beggar, he offers to help him find a cure for his affliction. That night, she falls asleep to the idea that something extraordinary might happen to save her. The next morning, she is awakened by the sound of people gathering in the square. A sign announcing the auction of their possessions had been posted. Emma's maid suggests that she go see the town notary. Emma decides to take her up on the offer. When she arrives, Maître Guillaumin suggests that they have an affair. Emma realizes that he is asking her to sell her body to him, and she gets indignant and storms out. She next goes to Binet, the tax collector, to, we can only imagine, ask for an abatement of her taxes. Finally, she goes to the nurse's house and flings herself on the bed. The nurse is perplexed as to why she is there, but it is the only safe place Emma can seek refuge. Emma suddenly remembers Leon's promise to come save her. She sends the nurse to see if he is waiting for her. When the nurse returns, she tells Emma that Leon is not there and has not been there. In a final act of desperation, she heads for Rodolphe's house. Although she had just refused Guillaumin, she seems unaware that she will be in the same sense prostituting herself to Rodolphe. Part 3, Chapter 8. Emma does not know how she was going to approach Rodolphe. She entered his house the same way she always had and found him in his bedroom. Rodolphe makes excuses for his breakup with her, and she believes him. Finally, after much reminiscing, she asks him for the money. He tells her that he does not have it, which he genuinely does not, and she does not believe him. She quickly leaves him in a daze. Emma is so distraught that she barely knows she is alive. Finally, she decides to go to the pharmacy. She persuades Justin to give her the key to Homais' room where he mixes his medicines. Because Justin has grown so fond of Emma, he cannot refuse her. She immediately goes to the arsenic bottle and crams handfuls into her mouth. When she arrives at home, she feels a sudden peace. Charles had arrived home much earlier than she had. He was in turmoil about the notice. When Emma arrives home, he asks her for an explanation. Instead of giving him an answer, she writes him a letter and tells him to read it the next day. Within a short amount of time, she begins to feel ill. Charles tries to determine what she had eaten. While he sits at her side, she sees love in his eyes such that she had never known. Finally, they decide to call for other well-known doctors in the area. Charles discovers it is arsenic after reading Emma's letter prematurely. Emma calls for Berthe, and she holds her and says goodbye. When the other doctors arrive, they try to give Charles some hope, but they know it is just a matter of time. Finally, Emma cries out, "The blind man." Then cries out, "The blind man." Then she dies. Part 3, Chapter 9. Charles begs to stay with Emma in her chamber. However, everyone convinces Charles to leave her under the watchful eye of his friends. Almays encourages him to decide on a time for her funeral. Charles says he wants no expense spared. He decides to have her buried in a casket of oak, inside a casket of mahogany, inside a casket of lead. Almays and the priest watch over the body together and have a long discussion on religion. Almays says he is not a Christian, though he does respect Christianity. Charles continues to sneak into the room to say goodbye to her. Finally, her father arrives for the funeral. Part 3, Chapter 10. Almays' letter to Monsieur Rouault had not reached him for 3 days, and he headed to Yonville at a dead heat. Charles' friends gloss over the events surrounding Emma's death in an attempt to spare her father. At the funeral, Charles watches and cries. When Emma is lowered into the ground, he tries to throw himself in with her. Charles' mother imagines them living the rest of their days together, and she is so relieved to finally have her son's affection back. Part 3, Chapter 11. Charles sends for Berthe, who gradually forgets her mother. Many of Emma's bills come due, and each time he thinks he has seen the last of them, another one crops up. Leon sends him a wedding announcement, and Charles imagines that he must be happy. One day, Charles discovers Rodolphe's goodbye letter. He denies that anything could have happened. He is forced to sell all his possessions, and it pains him to see Berthe dressed in rags. Almays finds great success and even writes a book. He also adopts bohemian ways and tries to live the life of a successful man. Finally, Charles discovers all of Emma's love letters. He sees Rodolphe and tells him that he does not blame him. The next day, Charles dies on the bench where Emma had carried on her love affair. Berthe goes to live with her grandmother, who eventually dies, and she is sent to work in a cotton mill.